Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to all of you on this beautiful day. It is an absolute delight to see so many familiar faces here for what promised to be an engaging and insightful event. This event is organized by NUD Representative Office UK and Spring Development Bank of Myanmar and kindly co-hosted by the University of SOAS. Today, we are in here for a treat as we have privilege of hosting the brilliant Sean. His passion for Myanmar and his remarkable dedication to its development make him a true gem for Burmese people. And we are incredibly fortunate to have him with us today. Today's programs includes keynote speech from our esteemed guest Sean, and followed by the Q&A, and a closing remark from our NUG representatives UK. Once again, a big welcome to all of you. Let's make this event. Before we begin, please take a moment of silence. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones and other electronic devices. Without further ado, let's dive in today. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Chanri, a distinguished member of the academic community here in SOAS, to welcome Sean. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sean Turnell. Sean worked in the private sector in Australia before receiving his PhD and a new career in academia, researching Burmese history. His interests were particularly in the colonial period, and in the economic history of the colonial period. And what I think he is known most for, at least by me, for this period was his revisionist history of the Indian chettyards during the World Trade Depression. And as many of you know, the anti-Indian riots of the 1930s and a good deal of anti-colonial resentment were caused by often the exaggerated belief that, corrected by Sean, the Indians had somehow on their own plundered the personal economies of everyday Burmese cultivators through predatory loans and reaping the titles to their lands when the loans cannot be repaid. When the transition government took power in 2011, and a few years later, a half a decade later, when the NLD formed a new government, creating the position of state counselor for Aung San Suu Kyi to circumvent the restriction on her participation embedded in the 2008 Constitution promulgated in 2010, Sean was lending his services to the new government. With his knowledge of finance and banking, but also its history, he was able to recommend economic reforms. Standing in the way of these, of course, were a group that had really pilfered the economy, the Damodar leadership. In 2020, when the NLD won a large enough section of the electorate to enable it to perhaps challenge the Constitution and the Damodar's privileged and protected position within it, the writing was on the wall. I now believe that everyone knew this, but we were going to force the issue through a showdown with the military. Aung San Suu Kyi refused to budge at General Min Aung Hlaing's request to delay the newly elected majority to take their seats while he figured out what to do. I remember that final weekend, even in the UK, we heard through the grapevine that ministers expected to be arrested very soon. Then on Monday, the 1st of February 2021, the Damodar moved. President Win Myint and State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi were taken into custody on various charges, while Vice President Myint Sway became acting president and invoked a clause in the Constitution that allowed the military to take emergency powers. Several days later, on the 6th of February, Sean was also arrested and charged with violating state secrets. What I remember was said at the time was that Sean was carrying files with the details of the Damodar leadership's extensive financial holdings. Sean, like Aung San Suu Kyi and Vicky Bowman, a former British ambassador to Burma and co-head of an NGO working on ethical business practices in Burma, were convicted on various charges. Most of the international attention at the time was on these arrests, but after the CDM, the CDM failed to stand down, more arrests of Burmese followed. Torture and deaths in custody, and then eventually the revolution or civil war, depending on how you understand it, that we have now. Under international pressure, but overtly as part of a large amnesty in honor of National Victory Day, on the 17th of November 2022, Sean and Vicky were released after nearly 2 years in insane prison. notorious for its absence of minimum standards for prisoners, and additionally, Sean had been kept in isolation. Aung San Suu Kyi and others, as we know, are still in prison, and Aung San Suu Kyi will be in prison likely for the rest of her natural life, unless released, we all hope, as a result of an NUG victory in the current struggle to liberate the country from tyranny. Now, Sean has published a book on his experiences, which I have not yet had a chance to read, but I'm sure we're all eager to, we all are eager to hear Sean speak at the moment. So I give the floor to him now and thank him for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you very much.
Firstly, thank you everyone for turning up on what this person from Sydney thinks is a really cold day. I'm sure it may not be for you. I'm also told, Larry Jagan told me earlier that there's a big match on, Manchester United versus Manchester City or something like that. So the idea that you're giving that up is a compliment as well. So yeah, thank you for the welcome. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for all of your support during the time when I needed it, when I was in the prison. I got lots of reports of the support I was getting from Burmese communities all around the world, as well as people from the UK. And in fact, actually people from the UK and even the UK government, the UK embassy, were very much supportive of me. So this gives me an opportunity to thank, I guess, the UK, but particularly, I suppose, the Burmese community here in the UK, who, like Burmese communities everywhere, have been so incredibly welcoming and generous and all that. And that's one of the themes of the book, is just that very thing. So, yeah, so thank you everyone for that. Just a little bit of an explanation on the book. It's very frustrating that, because it got published in Australia about 2.5 months ago, something like that, and you get it everywhere in Australia. It's at the airport, bookshops, it's all of that, but over in England there's hardly any copies. I think they underestimated that there would be demand and that people would be interested in Burma. I think they underestimated the size of the Burmese diaspora population as well. So it's a bit of a story internationally that there's just not enough copies. It's sort of the mirror of what usually happens in Australia, because in Australia, whenever a book comes out, you just expect that, I have to wait for a couple of months and all that, and now it's sort of the reverse. But anyway, so I am hopeful that many more copies will come in a month or so. Penguin have assured me on that. But anyway, apologies in advance though, the book itself is not here. Okay, the really nice thing I think we've got today is that there's plenty of time to do questions and answers and all that, which is great. So the remarks I'm going to make could easily, I think I've got half an hour and I've used a few minutes already, so I probably won't even finish, but we can cover what people want to know, which is more important in the questions and answers and all that. And so I thought what I'd try to do is use some of the stories of the book, but then to use that as a trigger point into some broader observations about Myanmar now and where things are going and all of that. So I thought I might just blend the two. And as a way of summarising it, you know what? The other thing, I should thank the organisers for this. Thank you, Mike Johnny, for your lovely remarks. Mike's work is well known to me over the decades, actually, and both myself and my students and so on have been big followers down the years. Thank you to Luann and Scarlett and Coco, all the whole team at NUG and the incredible Spring Development Bank. Thank you for all of your support, by the way. It's so appreciated. The work you do is just fantastic, I think, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about that actually while we're doing it. So big thank you on that front. In terms of the content, I noticed that the issues, I'm calling them the 7 Cs, sort of a bit of a play on the whole thing of the ocean, etc. But also there are just 7 things that I wanted to talk about that all begin with the letter C, funnily enough. So I want to talk about courage and compassion that was extended to me, cruelty and conditions. So obviously these things sort of relate to the prison, the arrest, stuff like that. The consequences of the coup and all that's followed. And there I want to dwell a little bit on the economic damage, because I should have put that caveat up the front, of course, is that I'm an economist. So I'm afraid you're going to get some economics today. And then, so that's under consequences. Then have a bit of a talk about collaboration, by which I mean what can the international community do to support the opposition movement and to undermine the SAC, basically. And then just touch upon what I'm calling creation, and that's just some of the really good stuff that I see coming out of the opposition movement and the NUG and so on. Some really good stuff. So I'm breaking under those headings of 7 headings beginning with the letter C, so hence the 7 Cs. Okay, but just to start off with this theme of courage and compassion, because that flows right through the book. And that courage and compassion doesn't relate to anything I did, but what I received from the Burmese people. So as you know, I was arrested or you may not know, but I was arrested on the 6th of February 2021, 5 days after the coup. Totally unexpected. The coup itself was unexpected to me, by the way. I'd been talking to Dorsu the previous weekend about it, and I was originally going to go up in Naypyidaw to present to her the latest economic plan that we'd all been working on. And on that weekend, this is the weekend immediately before the coup, the Saturday, that's right, the Saturday, I'd spoken to her and her chief of staff, who advised me to not come up to Naypyidaw, because I'd been down in Yangon, stuck there in quarantine from COVID, not to come up to Naypyidaw, not because they feared it was a coup, but simply that, as it was put to me, that there were rogue elements on the road that could make things difficult for someone like me, known to be associated with her. So we put off the meeting until the following week, and I was meant to see her on the Thursday, the Thursday, to go through the economic plan and all that, and of course events intervened and I was arrested and all that. I was picked up at the hotel, the Chatrium Hotel, for those of you might know about, in Yangon, where I was put for quarantine, for COVID quarantine. So I literally came out of quarantine. The coup took place immediately afterwards, arrested there in the lobby of the Chatrium. But that's the first point where I can just talk about the courage and compassion of the Myanmar people, because the very first thing that happened after being arrested and all that, taken out into this police vehicle, was that all of the staff of the Chatrium came out and lined the long driveway. And for those of you who know, the hotel really is a long driveway. They lined it and waved and gave this symbol, many in tears and things like that. It was incredible. At great risk. There were police everywhere, military intelligence guys, all that, all around them. And yet they did this, just because, to demonstrate their support for me. And so that was at the moment of arrest. And the good thing about that for me, I suppose, is that was the signal of how I was going to be treated by Burmese people right throughout, except for a few, which we'll come to. But that was the broader, as I say, set the tone, I think, from then on. I then went off and was taken to this place in the central, the SID, the Special Investigation Division of the police and so on, put in this box and interrogated for some time. But again, even there, another illustration of courage and compassion coming my way in the form of a guy called Jo San Han, who was a young police officer, an interpreter assigned to me. He didn't know what was going on. He was just suddenly asked to come to this place, to CID, to interpret for me. And he gave me some wonderful advice about how to cope and things like that. Some of the advice I didn't take. I thought I knew more and could talk my way out of it. But anyway, but again, another, just wonderful gesture. I spent 2 months in this box before then being taken to insane prison. And I've already spoken to people here. I know there are former political prisoners here. So I know you all know about insane prison. For me, up until that time, it was just something I saw from the aeroplane when you took off from Yangon International, right? The big wagon wheel was directly below you. But later, I, of course, experienced the full horror of just standing outside the gatehouse, right, which looked like some terrible medieval castle with that great big door. It's so big that there was even a door within the door, but it was a scene sort of like out of Lord of the Rings or something like that. So horrifying moment. taken into insane prison. But again, just to hark on this theme, nothing but compassion shown to me, this time by fellow political prisoners, who in many ways, in every way, actually, if I think about it, were in a much worse position to me, but showed great courage and compassion to me all the way through. And there's a couple of people I want to mention. A young man who I'm happy to say is still alive, and I spoke to one of his friends a moment ago, called Pai 2, whose opening line to me, so the police sort of dragged me into this area where the cells were, they call it a ward, and then sort of just left me there amongst the prisoners. And this very jolly man came up to me and said, "Sean, you're okay now, you're with us." And it was just such a relief. This was sort of the worst day of my life. And to have his smiling face and just say that to me was incredible. Having said that, though, I did think at the time, wait a minute, you're in prison with me. But anyway, he was as good to his word and really was, such a support and all that. Less happily, subsequently, wonderful man called Kin Mong Shui, but who used to go under the Muslim name of Jacob. Incredible man, very compassionate, extraordinarily kind to me, but very courageous, very brave. He hated the military regime, and he showed it. So he was very vigorous in defending my interests. As soon as anything would happen to me, he'd be right in the face of the guards and the police all the time. But he stood up for everyone, basically. So just a wonderful man. So again, another, with an unfortunate ending that I'll come to, but again, another example of courage and compassion shown to me. But then random compassion all the way through, sometimes even from police and prison guards. But again, I'm telling this audience nothing new, right? This regime is not supported, certainly by the majority of Burmese people, but not even amongst their own police and prison guards and all that, who would use lots of opportunities to signal that to you. So I was able to experience that, and I detail that in the book again and again. But then other times as well, I remember when I was later transferred up into Naypyidaw prison, and we were being taken from the prison to the courthouse every day, we'd sometimes get stuck in the traffic in Naypyidaw. And when at those moments, myself and Dorsu and the economics team, we were sort of in this one van, and if we looked into cars that are sort of drawn alongside, very often people would sort of look, check to see who the police were looking at and all that, and they very shyly, again, give us that symbol from their cars. So you get that sort of thing all the time. A couple of times I went to the hospital and so on. Again, just wonderful care and so on from people who likewise would signal all the time how much they hated the regime, wishing me luck, wishing me all the best and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, I guess what really stands out for me, not only the compassion shown to me, but also the fact that these were people whose position was much worse than mine. Because even though it took me 2 years nearly to get out, I knew that I would get out. And I knew that I had a whole government, a whole country, and countries like England, etc., behind me as an individual, but they didn't have anything like that, and yet they would extend all sorts of things to me in all sorts of practical ways as well, giving me food, all that sort of thing. Okay, so that's the compassion and the courage in giving that compassion. The other thing, though, I don't want to shy away from the horrible bits, right, which was also the incredible cruelty. A little bit came my way, but much less so than, again, my Burmese colleagues. Numerous examples. The most distressing to me personally, I mentioned the incredible compassion and so on displayed to me by this man called Jacob, Kin Mong Shui. He was later murdered. So I spent 6 months in insane prison, then got transferred up to Naypyidaw, where I was put on trial with Dorsu and imprisoned with her and the rest of the ministers for the next year. I met Jacob in insane, so I then didn't see him for that whole year. And then I got, after being convicted and convicted of being a spy, taken back to insane prison after that. And then one of the first things I did when I got there was to say, well, where is Jacob? I'd love to see him again and all that. And I'll never forget, one of the prison staff said to me, oh, Sean, you can't, he's gone. And my first reaction was, oh, this is great, like he's been released, this is really good. And I think the happiness showed on my face. And he said, no, Sean, you don't understand. He's dead. he's been killed. And it turned out that he'd been beaten and kicked to death by the prison guards. There'd been a sort of fake sort of fight took place in the prison, and when he tried to break it up, and that was very typical of him. Again, that's the sort of person he was, very much a moral leader and so on. But as soon as he intervened, then the guards turned on him, and the two people who, it turns out the fight seems to have been a fake anyway, all of them turned on him, attacked him, and then he lingered on overnight and died the next day. So that, at a personal level, that was sort of, obviously touched me deeply. But the whole prison system, the whole thing of the SAC was incredibly cruel across the board. Towards the end of my imprisonment, when I came back to Napier, back to Insane, I was put on with the prisoners on death row. So the whole area I was in was where they were. And the first thing I noticed this was I was taken into this area, and I noticed that the prisoners, as usual, had hung up their clothes to dry, right? So you just wash your clothes in these concrete tanks and then put them out to dry. And the uniform of the normal prisoner is blue shirt, blue longi. But these were orange. And I knew immediately what it was. As soon as I saw this, I thought, oh my God, this is death row, because the death row prisoners have to wear orange. And of course, the timing of this is about 3 months after those executions that took place from memory, early 2022, I think. But anyway, just a horrible event, as we all know. Myanmar had the death penalty in for for decades, but it hadn't actually been used, and then it was used in those horrible ways. And so, but even just the conditions in which those prisoners were being held was just terrible, and the cruelty, I think, extended to them. Well, once again, though, if I can just go back to the compassion of the people, of Burmese people, displayed to me, these death row prisoners, who I'd got to know a bit, were just so extraordinarily generous. They saved up they used to get a bread ration as well as rice and so on, and they would save up the bread to give to me, because they thought, oh, that foreigner, he must be sick of rice, he needs some bread. But these are people on death row, for goodness sake. Luckily, I was able to get some chocolate chip cookies that my wife had sent me and send them back to them. But anyway, again, just illustrate so many things. He was there just routinely every day, just stupid stuff. Prisoners forced to do menial labour for no apparent reason in the middle of the sun, and often really pathetic stuff. But people who were beaten, I saw many people being beaten, saw the evidence of beatings later, heard them being beaten in the night. All that sort of stuff was pretty much routine. But we know that, of course, when we talk about cruelty, so, this is just my micro view in the prison, but if we look at Burma more broadly, right, this is the SAC regime strategy, is to actually conduct the horror. That is the strategy. The horror is not a byproduct. That is the purpose of what they're doing. So we know, and shouldn't be surprised about that. The conditions, one of the other C's, just awful. I know this is all a bit depressing, but that's the truth of it. The conditions are awful that the prisoners are kept in. Insane prison itself, of course, is very old, built in the late 19th century. It's a panopticon, which was an idea invented, in a sense, or promoted by the famous British philosopher and reformer Jeremy Bentham, whose body is just a few streets away, on display, I think, still on display. Anyway, so it was meant to be a more humane way of building a prison, but of course that's over 100 years ago, so the prison is in a terrible state, so the conditions really are awful. As an Australian, all I can say is that it reminded me of Australia's convict past. So everything about the prison was of that old colonial era. So when they put handcuffs on you and so on, it wasn't modern handcuffs. These were old iron handcuffs that were all rusty and all that, and big chains. It was just exactly as you'd imagine an old dungeon, a medieval prison would look like. So conditions were just awful. The heat was terrible, the insects. It was hard not to, even now, it's hard not to obsess about the insects that would come into the cell. The most annoying were the ants that would just come in burrow their way into your food and all that. But the most horrifying, I think, were the scorpions, big black scorpions about this big, and who allegedly had a thing for getting in the toilet, in the squat toilet, and that had a certain psychological effect, I can tell you. Anyway, there was the scorpions, and then these giant centipedes, which were poisonous as well, which I've never come across before, but they looked horrifying, and they would come in and out. And then, so, you know, compared to the scorpions and the centipedes, the normal rats, mosquitoes, spiders, and all that was all sort of second division stuff. But anyway, so all pretty horrible in terms of condition. The prisoners likewise, health services, in fact, it's bizarre to even use that expression, right? Health services, I mean, they're just none. In the book, I talk about one of my colleagues, lovely man, very much a coming person in the NLD government, would have been a real reformer, actually had the coup not taken place. One day he fell and broke his leg, because there was lots of, I mean, health and safety didn't exist or anything like that, so there was all sorts of ways in which you could fall over and do harm to yourself. He fell into a ditch, broke his leg, and it was one of those ones where, you know, if this is his leg, it broke so much that his leg just hung like that. And the prison doctor, this was up in Naypyidaw, came and looked at it and said, I can't do anything, I don't have the forms to fill out, right? And then said, I think it's all right anyway. Like, again, the leg was like this. And then one of the other political prisoners, this fantastic guy who had been a very senior official in the Ministry of Health and was a real doctor compared to the prison doctor, actually said, grabbed this doctor and said to him, you must do this. You've taken an oath. This is meaningful. You must do something for him. And eventually, just through that sheer force of personality, he forced something to be done. But yeah, so in talking about conditions, all of that sort of happen all the time. Okay, now I want to broaden it out a bit by looking at consequences, but in a sense just staying with that theme. So if there's all these terrible conditions, cruelty and all that are taking place in the prisons, then that's true of the broader society as well. So in talking now about consequences, I guess I want to just talk about a little bit about the economics now. Now, obviously, since I came out, I've been able to get a full view of what's been going on in the economy, but even in the prison, we knew everything was collapsing. And you could see it all the time in all sorts of little ways. Shortages of food every now and then. And so by the time I was released in November 2022, you could see the food quality and volumes and all that had begun to trend down. But you could see things like that happen in different times all the way through. There's also a system where you can get food brought in and the guards get sort of kickbacks to bring food in and things like that. You can see the prices really increasing through that. In the book I talk, now I'm going to put my economist hat on, because economists are obsessed by money and what money is and all that. And as economists, we're particularly obsessed by this story that came out of World War II about how in prisoner of war camps, cigarettes functioned as currency. In Insane, cigarettes didn't function as currency because they were worth too much. They were banned, but they were still there, of course, but they were worth too much. So what functioned as currency were those sachets of coffee, those 3-in-1 sachets. They were the means of exchange. So everything was compared to that. So you could see that the economy was going crazy just by the prices. So again, and I was in prison with the other economists, so we would talk economics all day and just sort of analyse what was going on with the coffee sachets as to what was happening. Anyway, so we could see the economy was collapsing. Plus, of course, I mentioned Insane, sitting there under the flight path of Yangon, you could just see that the planes just disappeared. Now, to be fair, some of it was COVID and all that, but you could, as something of an aviation buff myself, I used to watch the planes coming up and down all the time, and the number just dramatically decreased. So there's a number of indications we had in the prison that things were going badly. We could also see the guards, funnily enough, their living standards declining as well, and even their attempts to extract stuff from us, the prisoners. You could get a feel for where everything was going on. But pulling back and looking at the broader thing, which we didn't see in the prison, but after I got out, I saw it all. I mean, the devastation, the consequences of this coup has just been phenomenal. It's rare in history to have seen such destruction of wealth and so on in a country. So even now, GDP in Myanmar is 10% below what it was in 2019. Even now. So with a couple of years of alleged catch-up. But even that is an exaggeration. So you see that number bandied about, the World Bank says it, etc. But what they don't take into account is, of that GDP, there's been a huge substitution. Much of that GDP is now military spending. So when the regime builds a fortress or digs a trench or a fighter plane or a tank or whatever, that counts as a contribution to GDP. Now, you imagine if the economy even now is 10% below what it was in 2019, and within that, there's been a huge shift of resources into military equipment and so on, then that really tells us that the true living standards, the real civilian economy, is dramatically smaller than it was before, and therefore, people's ability to survive and so on. And we can see that in all sorts of other ways. So just to not bore you too much, but with some of the numbers, inflation at the moment, 29%. And again, these are underestimates, right? Because these are official numbers from the World Bank and things like that. The proportion of population in dire poverty, more than doubling to 40%. Budget deficit, etc., just completely blown out. All that careful work that we've done at bringing in proper fiscal policies and budgetary rules and all that, just totally swept aside and destroyed. Budget deficit now completely blown out. They finance it, they don't look at the good ways of financing budgets, developing bond markets, all that stuff you need for a modern economy. All that totally wiped away. They're just printing money again. So much so that when the German firm that was supplying the equipment just pulled out, they've now, in a desperate sort of search to get printing plates developed to sustain the level of money printing they're doing. From that, we've seen all sorts of other things. The exchange rate worth a third of what it was, the JAT now down to a third of what it was before. Balance of payments, deficits, so Myanmar's trade substantially negative. Foreign direct investment, gone. There's almost nothing to speak of. All that means incredible lack of foreign exchange that the regime needs, because of course they've so degraded the country's infrastructure and its industrial capacity. Myanmar needs to import all sorts of things, but including military equipment. But where are they going to get the money from? They can't use the JAT. They can't just print the JAT and buy fighter planes from Russia. They've got to find some foreign currency, some hard currency, and they're in terrible straits on that front. And that is, I think, another avenue through which we can see just how desperate they are when we look at all the policies they're employing to confiscate, in a sense, foreign exchange right across the board. There's many examples of it. I'm running out of time, so I won't go into examples of it, but many of them. The banking sector, which I spent a lot of time trying to fix up, well, not me personally, but the reformers spent time trying to fix up, is now in a terrible state. The non-performing loan, the bad debts of the banks, before the coup was over 50% of their portfolio. Now, to give that an illustration of that, in the global financial crisis, international banks used to have non-performing loans of about 7-8% of their portfolios. We're talking 50. This is before the coup. Now, you can imagine that since then, the economy's cratered, all sorts of other businesses have just walked away from debts and so on. So the banks, mostly insolvent before, must be in terrible, terrible state. Microfinance, for instance, too, often has incredibly good repayment rates because of various methodologies they employ. Their NPLs are just blown out as well. Most of them are insolvent. Myanmar's back on the blacklist for money laundering and all that. So just to say that just in that financial area, the country is in incredibly dire straits. But that also is another avenue then through which the regime is desperate, absolutely desperate and ruthless. I mentioned about the economy now shifting across to military equipment. I think that's something we really need to think about when we think about Myanmar these days. You know, there's an expression in economics that often applies to Myanmar that it's a transition economy. Well, Myanmar's not transiting anymore, right, to anything. It's not in transition. What they've done is effectively moved it into a war economy. If I think historically, it sort of reminds me of the stories one hears about the economy of Russia immediately after the Russian Revolution, that so-called war economy war communism, they called it. But that's essentially what it is. So when we look at the policies of the SAC regime, it's not the standard sort of economic policies, right? This is not a regime that cares about living standards, doesn't care about the ratios of GDP or anything like that. Their focus, how do we get resources to sustain the war? That's it. There's really no other focus. And that's important, I think, to remember when we think about strategies to oppose them, etc. Health and education expenditure, even according to the official numbers, 15% below now compared to 2019. Military spending up 63% across that same period. These are official numbers. The real numbers would be much more than that. So again, just this incredible shift across. Just confiscation of assets, confiscation of foreign exchange and all that. So property rights, great foundations of economics, just pushed aside. But to me, the best example of the shift, this latest thing, last few weeks, maybe signalling, again, just how desperate the regime is, conscription, right? So not only do you not have security in your property, you don't even have security over your own self as property, right? So all of that abrogated in the country, as far away from good economic policy making as can be imagined. Collaboration in terms of international economy now, the second last C, just to highlight there what to do. What does the international community do about it? That leads us into the question of sanctions. The thought I just wanted to leave you with quickly is just that we're dealing with a different regime now, right? In the past, sanctions could be used to shame. It could be used to try and shape behaviour. This regime is not going to change behaviour. It cannot be shamed. It's completely shameless. So the only way that sanctions will work is by reducing the capacity, reducing the capability of the regime to do what it's doing. And we're on the right track on that in focusing on foreign exchange, because that is the thing they need to buy the military equipment and all that. It's the one resource that they can't create themselves. So when we talk about sanctions, to me, we need to think about it through that lens. It's not about sending a signal, it's actually about trying to reduce the capacity of the regime to support itself militarily. Then finally, on a happy note, I don't want to end on a bad note, and that's just to say something that I observed before the coup when I was working in that Myanmar Development Institute. I came across so many young Burmese people, about a couple of dozen working with us, who were just so good, so effective, so smart, so savvy about the world and all that. That's continued on. Since coming out, I've just been overwhelmed by the extraordinary innovation, etc., in the whole opposition movement, particularly within the finance part of the NUG. I can remember when, in the NLD government at the start, it was hard to get any reforms through. There was always resistance, all sorts of things going on. It seems to me that the finance people of the NUG have just taken on all that good stuff, right? The good things needed reform as a matter of course. Of course we're going to do this, but also we're going to do this, this and this. So I've really just been quite struck by the generational shift amongst the core people who I think will be the policy makers, and just how encouraged and impressed I think I am, but I think anyone is if you look at what's actually going on. And obviously for me, my exposure was mostly to the finance people, but I found it overwhelming just how good they are, of which, of course, that development bank is part of that story. Okay, so I'm going to end on that positive note, just to say that, all the indicators that we look around, whether they be military, whether they be financial, whether they be economic, all of those, it seems to me, are pointing in that same direction, that the SAC regimes, that days are numbered. Having said that, we all know that they will act with particular savagery. This is existential now. They know that they win or they end up strung up under a tree, right? So that's the stakes. So they'll be savage on the way out, but it does look like that they're on the back foot. So one might be optimistic on that. The other point of optimism, as I mentioned, is just that extraordinary positive aspect of just, to me, just how good the people opposing the SAC regime are. All right, well, I should end there, and look forward to questions and discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sean. Now we have